morning, everyone. We've had a very interesting session in the morning, the first session that we had. Professor Ajay Kumar talked about, gave you a whole history starting from Aristotle down to Marxism and post-structuralism. The entire terrain was in a way covered. So I don't want to go through the entire thing, and then you have very dedicated sessions coming in after this. So I don't intend to do that. Rather, what I thought I'll do is to talk about what I do as a teacher, as somebody who tries to write scribble articles once in a way, and the way in which I have tried to do theory in my way, and what I have understood of doing theory. I think that is what I'll try and do. I will also, I will say, begin by saying that I also was a student of the 1980s, like Professor Ajay Kumar. The thing is that I finished my MA after he did his MA, 2-3 years younger to him. But then the things that we did as students were similar. We studied in the same university, so the kind of exposure that he had was no different from what I had. My big brush, so to speak, with literary theory happened at the Institute of English when I came here for my MPhil program. That is when I heard of something called structuralism. I heard of a person called Derrida, and I heard of something called feminism. I was never exposed to all these things. So I remember once when I was doing my MA, Professor C.P. Shivdas from Calgary University had come to my college and had given a lecture on semiotics, and I remember I couldn't make out anything of that. That was my fault. Professor C.P.S. was an excellent teacher, a great scholar, a great translator. So that was my initial brush with this. When I was doing my MA, the most agonizing moments as a student was studying tradition and individual talent. So you would know what my mindset was as a student. I thought at that point that this was a very difficult essay, and I was wondering, my God, why did this guy have to do this? He had already written something called The Wasteland, and then he has made it all the more difficult with something like this. This was, I would say, adding oil to fire, because my teacher had, when we discussed John Donne, he referred to this essay on metaphysical poets and Hamlet and his problems. I mean, if he had a problem with Hamlet, I don't know why he had to rub it on us, on me, because I happened to discover something called objective correlative. But then now, when I reflect on that, when you look at the entire, all the critical essays, all the essays that Eliot had written, you will never see him repeat that phrase. That's the only essay where he has used it. He was a playwright, and we have to ask whether he had objective correlatives in the plays that he had written. This is very important, right? So I'm not saying that I was conscious of all this as an MA student or even as a BA student. But then when I think about it today, these are the kind of questions that come to me. So let me go back to the traditional individual talent essay. Not to talk about that essay, but then to draw your attention to something that that really caught my attention after some years of teaching. Not that essay, but then some years of teaching literature. See, in this text, he talks about how writers need to become aware of tradition and how writers have to escape their personality, and then you have a whole tradition talking to you, and then you have the tradition speaking through you. When you hear it for the first time, it's absolutely fascinating. You have a whole tradition speaking through you. Now, what does it mean to say that a whole tradition speaks through you? It's something that's very visual for me. It takes me back to a very old K. Balachandra film, in Tamil, black and white film, which starred a very, very young Kamala Hassan. And the same film was done in Malayalam also. And there's a song there. In the Tamil version, you have S.P. Balasubramaniam, a very young SPB, singing the song. And in Malayalam, it is sung by P.J. Chandran. I don't know if you recall that. There's a scene there where there's a wedding, and you have this young Kamala Hassan standing there in front of a mic, and then he starts singing. There is something else that he has in his hands. I don't know if you have seen that. There's a doll, and his hands are there, and then there's a song. You have the person singing, and then the doll. You know what that is called?
Ventriloquism.
Ventriloquism. What else was Eliot doing? He introduced, I would say, academic ventriloquism. This is one of the first. This is what I think we do as teachers, perhaps, in the classrooms. We come with a whole lot of theory, we read all these things and come here and we bombard our students with this. This is what Foucault said, this is his grandfather, this is what he said. We talk about all this. So there is somebody who's speaking through you. You become that mechanism, that contrivance. Somebody is speaking through you. I would say, unfortunately, this is what has happened. And perhaps that is the reason why all of us are sitting here, the hall is packed. I think that is the more pressing reason as to why the hall is packed. Because we all will be wondering, what the hell are we doing when we talk about theory? I'm sure you would have been confronted by this question when you had your syllabus, and then you had to write an essay on signature, sign and play, or whatever it is. This is my take on it, and I am pretty wary of that. I generally do not load a whole lot of theory in what I do in my class, but then, given the kind of times in which we live, we need to be aware of what it is that is happening around us. We need to know our kind of theory, but then we need to know how to know theory. I think that is very important. So how does one go about it? What I'll do is I'll not give you a straight answer, but I'll take you back to a very old person who had apparently a beard, maybe much more whiter than mine, who had this habit of watching a number of plays, and he would go and watch all these plays for years, for every festival. In Malayalam it's called Kalchashila. He perhaps did watch a number of plays, watched it, all these competitions, all these performances, he watched all those plays. Not that he was studying in a university and he had to submit a PhD thesis, but then he had watched these plays, and that's the best way in which to describe the evolution, the writing of poetics, Aristotle's poetics. How else do you think you can have somebody coming up with this remarkable one line, plot is the soul of tragedy? That is theory for you. So how do you evolve theory? How do you write theory? It has to come from you. It is not something that you read from books, try to memorize it, and then try to apply it to text. This is the in thing. We all apply theory to text, and that is what students are expected to do. I always tell my students that there are only two things that you can apply: lipstick and a coat of paint on the wall. You cannot apply anything else. So if we are told that we have to apply theory, I think you have to tell this person you cannot apply theory. The only thing you can do is to do theory. And how do you do it? It good old Aristotle did. It's the good old way that maybe whoever composed Natyashastram did. It's a way in which Professor Upanishad would have come up with this idea of Andarsannivesham. There is no other way in which you can do theory. So let's go back to what the way in which Aristotle would have tried to come up with that very cryptic statement, plot is the soul of tragedy. It would be the same thing when you look at the entire trajectory of literary history, critical literary history. Professor Kumar talked about Wordsworth, Coleridge, a whole host of thinkers that we study for our BA, for our MA, but then we hardly refer to Wordsworth's theory of poetry if you are writing a project on poetry. I think the problem lies there. How, for example, do we understand a writer like Wordsworth and what his understanding was about poetry? What we do is we read off Wordsworth's definition of poetry and we would refer to chapters 14 and 17 of Biography Literary and say these are the differences that they had as period finished. We hardly think of a philosopher who lived in England, whom, let's say, Wordsworth had read, not in English but in French, got inspired by that text and then came up with his idea of what a poem is or poetry is. I'm talking about someone called John Locke. It is John Locke that you are reading when you read Wordsworth. And it is a German intellectual thought that you are reading when you read Coleridge. This is the difference. So there's a way in which we need to get some of these ideas into our system. See, Wordsworth talks about how the language that used in poetry is the language of men. There's something very crucial there. He's talking there about a kind of validation. I read something and somebody out there needs to understand what I've written. And that will happen only if there is a shared competence of language. And that's exactly what John Locke was talking about. This whole idea of, we talk about, for example, let me jump. We talk about, when we study structuralism, and then we all study an essay called The Nature of the Linguistic Sign, with the image, a picture of the tree, etc. And then the teacher struggles with this in the class, students struggle a lot more with it, and then we all wonder what are we going to write for the exam. We all do this. I hope I am fairly accurate in this description. You know why this happens? This happens because we have not been able to read it the way, I'm not saying we ought to read it, but then we have not been able to get at the foundations of it. When you read your Susu, you will not understand what this guy was doing if, again, you do not go back to someone like John Locke. John Locke was one of those early philosophers who talked about or who recognized there is a problem, that the language that we use is arbitrary. And that needs to be grounded in the European philosophical tradition, which had a certain way of understanding human speech and human communication. Now, there is something called the Adamic doctrine of language, which is very theological, that God created the world and then He created man. He told man, okay, you go and have a good time. What will I do, God? So Adam was told, you go and name everything that you have. So he went around, named everything, and after some time he finished naming. Right? Then he was created. That is the story. But then, the point is that you have named it. So the name is absolute. This ties up in a very interesting way with the whole story of the Tower of Babel, as theology would give it. So you have given a name to it, it is absolute, it is fixed. So you don't have any complication. There is no problem of the signifier not relating to signified or whatever it is. You don't even worry about signification. Now, Coleridge, for example, was stuck there. Wordsworth was not. Because the intellectual route that Wordsworth took was much more Lockean. And that essentially was the issue that the two of them played out in their respective positions. Right? You will see an elaboration of this debate in a fantastic manner in the work of someone like Hans R. Sleff. He has a couple of essays which are absolutely brilliant, talks about this. So what I'm trying to say is that we skim the surface when we talk about theory or even understand it, without even understanding what is there deep down. So this is one little thing that I always keep in mind when I have to teach literary theory, or if I have to talk about Wordsworth or structuralism or post-structuralism. So look what it does. We always thought that Saussure was original. He was the one who came up with this whole idea that language is arbitrary. But when you look at the work of Saussure, Saussure nowhere would mention John Locke. Saussure would never mention John Locke. I have not also seen Derrida referring to Locke. I don't know if I have missed out somewhere, but then he doesn't talk about Locke. I'm not saying that Derrida would say that language is arbitrary or not something like that. I don't think he had talked about this, but then he would talk about so many other French and German philosophers and thinkers. But this is very strange that we did not, let us say in our curriculum, pursue this angle. It's very surprising because in the linguistics paper that we all do for our MA, we all would have studied something called Grimm's Law and Berner's Law. Now don't ask me what it is now, I've forgotten that. This is something I remember writing for the exams. I remember studying this, writing for the exams. But then, how many of us, for example, know that these two laws, ideas, evolved very much from the German philological tradition? Saussure, in a way, was reacting to the German philological tradition. But then, when I was taught my Grimm's and Werner's law, I didn't know this. I didn't know what this German philological tradition actually was. I didn't even know how it was linked, connected to Saussure and the post-Saussureans. I didn't know that. Now I know that there is this link. I hope you're getting what I'm saying. So this is not what I'm saying is that theory is not something that is very, very abstract. That this is something that we have to study and apply to texts. So then what else is this? I mentioned earlier, I was talking about how we have the ventriloquist. Let me go back to that. Let me go back to this whole thing. I certainly believe that the emergence of English studies in India, for example, in colonial times, that I would say had a lot of bearing on the way in which we have developed our curriculum, designed our courses, run our BA, MA program, and even worry a lot about literary theory, worry a lot about how to read and what to do with text. I think this is perhaps the biggest challenge that we have. I say this because if we go back and look at the early decades of the 20th century, we have people like I.A. Richards, who belonged to one kind of a school, and then F.R. Lewis, who belonged to another kind of school, and the two of them were at academic loggerheads. But then, both of them wanted Eliot to come and teach there. Because what they felt was, they felt that Eliot provided them the kind of template to teach, to read literature. So was this a problem with the reading public, or had this to do with the kind of concerns that Britain had, English professors in Britain had with literary texts and a whole reading public? England did have the journals, the magazines, the coffee clubs, people used to read. But then suddenly there is this very major, very important concern about evolving some kind of a template. And one way in which this template did evolve was this new critical tradition. And maybe fortunately or unfortunately, we still follow the new critical tradition in our classrooms. Consider, for example, one stock question that you will have if you are a student of literature. Attempt a critical appreciation of this poem. Don't we all do this even now? It goes back 100 years ago. And we are at the same time, the same breath, we talk about literary theory. Literary theory doesn't say that you must do a critical appreciation of whatever of a poem. In a way, what we do is we do this very, very close reading. But then that itself, the kind of problematics that you have in this kind of a reading, this kind of a positioning, was something that was hinted at in the 1930s, 1940s, around the first few decades of the 20th century, in a very fascinating debate between F.R. Lewis and not I.A. Richards, F.R. Lewis and René Welleck. The two of them had a big debate. I'm sure all of us know the kind of work that Lewis had done and the way in which he championed something called the great tradition. He had favorite poets, he had favorite novelists, and there were things that he was looking for in the novels of D.H. Lawrence, right? Or kind of poetry that he was championing at that time. G.M. Hawkins, for example, in New Bearings poetry. But then there was this big debate where Welleck asks him to clarify his theoretical position. You have references to this debate in a book called Discriminations. It's a brief reference to this. It's a very interesting reference that worth taking a look at. Lewis would look for life. That's what he would look for. And that was the yardstick that he had. So, this debate was already very much alive. And there were a whole lot of people who were worried about kind of debating about how exactly does one go about reading. This is the next part of what I'm going to say. How is it that, is this the method that we need to follow? In a class, when we go to a class, let's say we teach a poem. How do we teach this? Do we read the poem and then take it line by line, word by word, or by stanza and say, look, this is what the poem means actually? this is the meaning of the poem. Here the poet is trying to say this. And then the poet continues to talk about this. The poet tries to draw attention to these things. It is a typical new critical method that if we do this, then we'll be following. My theory, so to speak, is very simple. This kind of a reading is very fascinating to do. It has the fascination of a little child who goes to a shop where you have a number of these glass jars, right? And inside all these jars you have different kinds of sweets, chocolate, eclairs, 5-star bar, Cadbury's, all kinds of things are there, Snickers, everything. And think of this, imagine yourself as a kid going with your parents and then point your finger. And what does the shopkeeper do? He or she will be very nice and kind. Children are children. So morning over, and the father will lift you, and then he'll say, okay, you can take from whichever glass jar you want, you can take whatever you want. So what is it that you do? He opens the lid for you, the teacher opens the lid for you, and what do? You dip your hand and take a chocolate of your choice. That is the meaning of the poem. We think that a poem, a text for that matter, contains a meaning. The poem as a container. That is why we get so fascinated by this whole debate between form and content, which did bother a whole lot of the early 20th century thinkers. So we think that a poem contains meaning, which is what we have been told, and that is what the teacher is to do. Why should the teacher come to the class? To help you open the jar and take out the meaning. Think about this. Is this criticism? Is this the way in which we read? See, a poem or a text for that matter doesn't contain anything. When I read something, there are things that I give it. I give it something because the text has opened itself to me, because the text has given everything to me, because it's right there in the open. Page opens of itself to me and tells me, take it. So when I am given something and I receive it, what do I have to do? I have to give something in return. Because if I don't give something to it, I won't get anything. But I don't know what the poem is going to give me. It will depend on what I am going to give the poem. And I give things that I think I can give. And I give different things to this text every time, to this poem or whatever text that is, every time I look at it. Because I will discover that I have new things to give every time I open it. Oh lady, we receive but what we give. Panduri Kavi Kavide Panasana. Edanarayo. Oh lady, we receive but what we give. If you give me the correct answer, Dr. Lal will give you a 5-star bar. Any idea which poem this is? Rejection and Mode. But this is something that very much relates to what we do as teachers, what we do as readers, which is what we do every time we have a text in front of us. I am not talking about reader response. I am talking about the responsibility of somebody who is reading something. I'm not using these fancy terms. It's my responsibility. What is it that I need to do when I get something? Right? So, it is possible then, therefore, to tentatively evolve a certain kind of a theory of reading. We don't have to import concepts and theories to read. You go to a class, you have a text, or you have a book, and then you start reading it. I'm sure all of us would have our impressions. We would read, maybe there will be places there where we don't get much out of it. We might want to look at it again, a second reading, a third reading, which is very important. Because we need to ask, why is it that we read a poem a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time? You can teach us. We all probably would be teaching the same point for 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. Bore adikille. Yeah. Why is that so? Because there's a way in which you invent yourself, reinvent yourself every time you go to it. Because you create the text every time, every day. Otherwise, how else do you think it will be possible to stand and then talk about whatever text that you have? Do you think teachers come to the class keeping in mind theories and then applying it and then it doesn't happen? It doesn't happen. But then, there's a way in which you create the text when you read. This is what you do when you do theory. You create the text as you read. It is not the text is there's a way in which you get it into your system. There's a way in which you get the poem that you read or the novel that you read into your system, and it is no different from the way in which you would read your Derrida or your Foucault or Agamben or whoever that may be. What I've seen here very often in my department, in so many other places, is this fetish, so to speak, fascination. Fascination is not the word, fetish for theory. You read a whole lot of these theories and then, I would like to do a Foucauldian analysis of whatever it is. Or I would like to do a feminist reading or something. Right? It's already set. See, what happens is, you have flagged it in a certain way. It's a warning signal. Look, I am doing a feminist reading. It doesn't matter. A new book has come, and maybe in the class the teacher had introduced something on gender trouble, Judith Butler. Teacher Judith Butler. So, Judith Butler performing gender വെച്ചിട്ട് പുസ്തകം വായിച്ചായിരുന്നു. പുസ്തകം വായിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടാവില്ല. ഇത് കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ടാവും. There is this fundamental problem that we have there. There are some others who get absolutely bowled or fascinated by a particular kind of a thinker. Then you read this, you read that alone, and then it gets into your system. And then unfortunately what will happen is it will start poisoning your system. That's another kind of interlocution. I don't know if you've seen that happen. But in the time, I will do it only from that point of view. I'll do only a reading based on that. See, what happens is, I have a pet theory about this. Enjoy theory. This is my theory of doing theory. Theory is like the way in which we breathe. You take air in. Imagine this. You take it in and you hold it. How long can you hold it? You'll hold it for maybe 20 seconds. Try doing that. After that, you'll have to release it. What will happen if you don't release it? You will die. And what will happen if you die? You will not be able to breathe again. Very simple. You read, you get your theory, you get all these things, you read it, you take it to your system, but then, like breathing, you must also know how to release it. You must get it out of your system. Because if you don't get it out of your system, you won't be able to get anything else inside. Right? You won't be able to get anything else into your system. Very often this is what happens. You'll be stuck with something. But if you are able to breathe easily, breathe easy. Mohanlal Pandey പറഞ്ഞത് ഇങ്ങനെയാണ് തിയറി ചെയ്യേണ്ടതെന്നുള്ളത്. Breathe easy. Take the theory and get it out. So there would be ways in which some of these ideas that you read would percolate and discover, I would say, relationships, connections. It will be there. And you will discover ways in which it will work as you read. Otherwise what will happen is you will have all these things coming in, it will percolate, it will be a kind of a sedimentation. It will remain there, and nothing will happen. Digest. So this is how it needs to be done. You get it into your system, get it out of your system. And how will you get it out of your system? You don't have to consciously worry about it and say, look, this is what I am going to do. There's a way in which the things that you read would express itself, would manifest itself. You just need to keep your eyes and ears open and then look at what you're doing with what you have read. Try and see how it's expressing itself, manifesting itself in the work that you are doing. Otherwise, you will get stuck. You will get stuck with what are things that you have read, and you will be, in a way, beholden to what you read. You will never be able to listen to the other kind of stories or narratives that you get to hear. This is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have, that we, in the humanities, in literature departments especially, we tend to specialize too much. So you would have somebody who's a post-structuralist and somebody who's marked as an ardent deconstructionist. So Harikrishnan will be called every time to talk about deconstruction or postmodernism. So there's a way in which he is branded, right? Which is, I would say, which is not at all good for the way in which we teach, the way in which we read. I don't know if it makes sense, but I think a lot depends on the way in which we can creatively put to use, learn to use whatever that we have read of these thinkers. It's not that we have to read them and then use just that. Well, if Aristotle can write poetics, I can also write. I'm not kidding. I'm not joking. If we think that they're all big names, people of reputation, and they have said this, they have said that, language is taken apart, there is aporia, there is whatever. You feel that, but what more can I say? This is a very important, a very big threat that we have. We must not allow theory to overwhelm you or even silence you. We need to very creatively, like I said earlier, address, make sense of what we read in the way in which we can relate. I'll give you another example of this. I told you when I was doing my MPhil, I first heard this name Derrida, and then there was this big essay. There is a rupture in social sciences and that it begins like that. Rupture in that's how it starts. This was one of my presentation. There were presentations in the class. I remember sitting with my very senior teacher. He was doing his MPhil with us, he passed away, John Matthew. Arnold would sit and then he would read and I would read. We were trying to make sense of the whole thing. But it was very difficult. Only thing we found, the things that you understood, that there's something called a transcendental signified. Right? You talked about some of these things, and then how there are things that come in, and there is something called free play, and he difference about it. But then I found out it was possible to understand this whole idea of trace and difference, not by reading by Derrida or that essay, for which I remember reading a small one-page write-up in Malayalam. Derridakku oru turanna kattu. R. Vishwanathan, Calicut University Adhyavakar, he had written one essay. He says that you are also one of those descendants of Untitled Chapter. നമ്മൾ ചെയ്യുന്ന സാധന ഈ റൈറ്റിംഗ് ആൻഡ് റിലേഷൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എല്ലാ വർഷവും പൂജ സമയത്ത് അവധി എടുക്കും, പുസ്തകം വായിക്കേണ്ട 2 ദിവസത്തേക്ക്. But then the second day you go and you take the books, and then what is it that you do? You write Harisri. You write that Harisri Ganapati. How do you write that? You write Mangalam Elda. You write Edi Maichum Edum Maichum. We were doing it all the time, and that is what R.V. had written. You read it. See, there is a way in which he was very creatively corresponding, I must say, with an idea that we thought was entirely Western. So there was a way in which R.V. tried to, I'm not saying nativize deconstruction, but then try to recognize for himself, as it were, what this whole thing is all about. അപ്പം ആർവിക്ക് ആവാമെങ്കിലും എനിക്കും എൻ്റെ രീതിയിലാവാം. This is the thought that I had. It's not that I consciously thought about it, but then when I, for example, must have taught this essay a couple of times, it struck me that it's quite possible to understand what deconstruction is all about by going to the kitchen. In the morning, Professor Jagamar talked about how generally girls, women go to the kitchen, men don't go. But then I love to go to the kitchen, and to understand the relax, it's good to go to the kitchen. Particularly learn essay. How? Go to the kitchen, take an onion and start peeling it layer by layer. What is it that you have at the end of it? This is deconstruction. What do you have? Can you put back the onion? You don't. What do you have at the center of it? Does it have a center? Does onion have it? Doesn't have it. That in a way tells us a lot about how we create text, how we tell stories, how we create stories. That's why I said it's not a container where you dip your hand and you get the chocolate. Right? But then there's something else that's very fascinating that happens when you peel an onion layer by layer. I said, inside the onion, there's nothing there. But then, at the end of it, you will have a drop of tear on your eyes. Doesn't that happen? Meaning, if you want to look for meaning. The center is elsewhere. The center that you are looking for inside the onion was not there. The center was elsewhere. Right? So there's a way in which we learn to read this. There's a way in which we need to relate to what theory is all about. Very often what happens is we do not relate to what we read. It is prescribed and we have to take the exam. And so we get stuck. We don't know what to do with all this. But then you have to do your project. So you have to theory എന്തെങ്കിലും ഉപയോഗിക്കണം. You look around, theory. I take this and write something. It cannot work like that because you will not get anything out of it. You can have, I would say, umpteen examples of ways in which we discover how to get these things into our system. See, way back in the 19th century, Matthew Arnold was mentioned. He came up with touchstone method, grand style, and ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്. And he had in one of his essays, I think the function of criticism was present titled an essay. Function of criticism. In that he talks about literary criticism, this big debate that was going on about its status, that people would end up being critics if they have nothing else to do. Right? and it's a second class kind of an activity. But then, he was perhaps one of those early thinkers or writers to really recognize that rhetorical criticism, or what you do as a reader when you read, is something very creative. But then, unfortunately, he didn't push it. Neither did he push it, neither did Eliot push it, who also did talk about this. Eliot also had a similar essay. Even Eliot didn't do it. So these two writers who didn't do this. But personally I feel that we have to be very creative. If you have to respond to something, what somebody else has written, there's a way in which you respond, and it has to be, or it will have to be creative. That perhaps is the only theory that we have. It's the way in which we bring in, make those connections, establish, recognize those connections, and then try and see how far and how much something can be pushed. If we are able to do that in our readings, if we are able to do that in the way in which we talk about things, see, if we don't do that, then it will be a poor cut and paste job. It won't even be a cut and paste job, it will be a poor cut and paste job. Get it in? Doing theory is as simple as breathing. What I would like to do now is to stop here a little bit and see if you have any questions, any responses, anything that you would like to ask me. Yeah.
On.
So I was feeling very, while you were talking, it was kind of a contradictory thing. Because you pressed upon an issue that was very much relevant in Indian academic space. But at the same time, we are expecting the students to train them to read or to employ their own ways to read. But at the same time, we are expecting them to muddle up, absorb many things and then reproduce that same thing. So, I want to know your opinion whether it's high time that we overhaul the same thing, because this academic exercise can't continue because it doesn't make any sense. But at the same time, this has been continuing since, like you said, from the colonial period. So, wouldn't it be high time that we change it? It's not like we are getting devoid of the traditions. But what is your opinion, sir? So, how can we do it?
Certainly we have been talking a lot about decolonizing the classroom, which has not happened. I mean, we have to face it. This is my personal take on it. But then, why should you mug up something? Right? You enroll for a program, you enroll for a course, and since we have not sufficiently decolonized ourselves, right? We need to learn to live with those contradictions. I'm not saying reconcile ourselves to those contradictions, but then try and see what we can make of those contradictions. As William Blake would very famously put it, without contraries is no progression. So you have your curriculum, you have your text, you are asked to study this, you study it. But then there's a way in which you have to study it. If you do it with an eye on the question paper and the kind of questions that are routinely asked, you will get stuck. You will never be able to even recognize that there is this contradiction. This is one very important thing. But then it raises a very crucial question here, the point that you made. And that has to do with the way in which we design our exams. How much you try to teach students the different ways of reading or kind of discussions that you would have in the class, at the end of the day, attempt an essay on Hamlet's Nalilaki. Doesn't help. See, you never get a chance to apply your mind. This is a genuine problem, I agree. But then, even at that point, even when you get when you get such an inane kind of a question, try to see if you can creatively respond to it. Use those ideas. I'll give you an example. Last year, we had in our department, we had to teach Hamlet. Hamlet, Othello, all these plays were there. There's a general way in which we talk about Hamlet. We would say that Hamlet was the king, something was rotten in the state of Denmark, and then this guy comes here and then he goes mad. Or at least he pretends that he is mad, and then you have this whole debate trying to say that look, this guy actually was mad. Or that he was, to use that very, very big word, procrastinated. Right? He did that. And to top it all that, you have to bring in this Austrian guy who used prosthetics, who had people sit on couches, Freud, and said that this guy suffered from Oedipus complex. Oedipus vazhikku vannithe illa. So you have the staples of reading Hamlet. But then imagine what would happen in a class when you have students read the text and come up and tell them, look, what is it that you have in mind? So imagine what would happen. Think about this. Look at it as a classic crime thriller. It is a crime thriller. It is a perfect example of a whodunit. And it uses almost all the staples that K. Madhu employed in the CBA Diary Kurmal. Dummy to dummy, you have in that film. You have something very similar happening in Hamlet. No, I'm not trivializing the play. I'm talking about the kind of intense drama that you have in it. Now, how do you get it? Look at the eerie atmosphere with which the play opens. It's eerie. There is something called atmosphere there. And remember, these were plays that were performed in the afternoon, not at 6 o'clock in the evening. And how is it that you would create this kind of an eerie, this dark, brooding kind of an atmosphere? Right? And then you have the possibility of evolving a theory of verification. The whole play hinges on a theory of verification. You have this guy who would like to verify the veracity of what he has been told. He is a classic example of somebody living in post-truth era. We use this term post-truth today. He has been told a whole lot of things. How will I know? How will I know whether it is truthful or the actual thing or not? He goes around verifying it, which is what he does stage by stage. Verification offers its own version of the mousetrap. You have a mousetrap, whereby he'll catch the conscience of the king. See what it does? It becomes a remarkable example of a whodunit. And it opens up the play in unforeseen ways. You recognize that this is drama, this is theatre of the best order. You don't worry about objective correlatives. You don't. You don't worry about whether this guy had Oedipus complex. Perhaps Oedipus himself did not have any complex. Freud, I would say, had this complex and he put it on a myth. Right? See, what happens is, ഈ തൊണ്ട തൊടാതെ വിഴുങ്ങുക എന്നൊരു ഏർപ്പാടുണ്ട് നമുക്ക്. അതിന്റെ എല്ലാ കുഴപ്പങ്ങളും ഹാംലെറ്റ് വായിക്കുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ കാണും. So when I talk about this whole act of verification that structures the play, look at that. What kind of a theory am I using? Gender ആണോ? അല്ല. feminist deconstruction in Canada. But then it makes a lot of sense to me as a reader. But then, like I said, when I say that, look, he was already living in a post-truth era, there I bring in a concept which is bandied about these days. Right? So perhaps there, and only there, do I bring in an idea. And it's up to me to see whether I can take it further or I can push it, elaborate it or whatever. Right? We have this, we have ways in which you have somebody going in, investigating something, and who is in turn hunted by whatever you are looking at. It is perhaps here that you, from Hamlet, go back and look at another beautiful post-truth moment in Oedipus. But then, Oedipus complex alla Freud പറഞ്ഞത്. അതാണ് ഫ്രോയിഡിന് പറ്റിയ കുഴപ്പം. So look what I'm doing. I'm in a way talking about intertextuality, but then I'm not using that term intertextuality. This is what I said. I get something in, and it has to come as automatically as breathing. This is what we do when we read. I have nothing with me. I didn't prepare anything. This is what I'm going to do. No. So if I am talking about it, this is how I talk about it. If I write about something, this is how I write. I was given a signal. So thank you all again for laughing with me and listening to me. Thanks a lot. And thanks to Dr. Arnold.